Okay, this is lecture 2 in the Ancient Civilization lecture series. And in this series, or rather in this lecture, I'm going to talk about human migration and the impact that human migration had on the development of ancient civilizations and ultimately the modern world. So the first thing I want to talk about is I mentioned in the last lecture that climate change took place during the ice ages. And I know you guys often think quite a bit about ice ages from the movie Ice Age, or I should say not just you guys, but probably most people who've seen the film. But of course, that's talking about or referencing a much older ice age, the Paleolithic ice age. We are actually talking about a much more recent ice age that happened on this planet just about 15,000 years ago. That ice age that occurred then changed the climate so drastically that, in fact, humans began moving from where they had lived for millions of years out across the globe. The map that you're looking at on the screen actually is a map that shows the migration patterns starting in Central Africa. So that big sort of blob in Central Africa is really where humans originated, in what's called the Rift Valley. And it's also one of the richest regions for collecting of archaeological evidence of ancient humans because of the nature of the geology there. And so there's been lots of evidence uncovered demonstrating that this really is the oldest site for ancient humans. But humans didn't just stay in Africa. They moved up across into Europe. Many of the ancestors of the people that are in my classroom, because we have largely European heritage in our school, but also into Asia, people who have heritage with people from Asia, and not just Northern Asia, but also parts of Southern and Central Asia. You can see moved across the planet in some pretty interesting ways. Humans migrated in part because animals were migrating. As the planet changed, vegetation changed, and animals who were plant eaters, the herds, were moving out of Central Africa. And humans began following those herds, not necessarily because they were hunting them, but because humans were initially scavengers. And so they were actually following the predators because they were eating the remains left over by those predators. We tend to think of ourselves as being these very sort of sophisticated, powerful creatures, but when the ice ages happened 15,000 years ago, humans were really still kind of just scraping along and not the dominant creatures that we think of today. Well, as humans moved, they were able to access better food supplies. And as humans began eating more meats and having more protein in their diet, brain development led to some pretty stunning technological developments as well. And I talked about some of those technological developments in the previous lecture. So humans are moving out of Africa and migrating over the next several thousand years. This map that you're looking at now is sort of a different way to look at it. The archaeological record shows human migration patterns, but one of the most powerful modern tools that scientists have been using to trace human patterns around the world is through DNA. Because the X chromosome is shared by all of us. Everyone has an X chromosome, whether you're a woman or a man. What scientists can do is they can actually trace lineages through DNA markers on the X chromosome. It's fantastically interesting, and it's really important modern research. What this map shows, and it's kind of hard to see because we're not accustomed to looking at the globe like this, but if you look at the North Pole, you can see you can sort of orient yourself on this map. But now drag your eyes down to that Central African where it says East Africa, and you can see that researchers are able to trace back about 200,000 years the DNA. And you can see how ancient some of those markers are. Moving up into getting into the Americas, those markers, those DNA markers on the X chromosome are actually only about 12,000, between 15 and 12,000 years. So what we know is those people moved there most recently. So the oldest points are in Central Africa, moving across to West Africa, of course, up into the Middle East, into Northern Asia, and so on and so forth. The consequences of this human migration are pretty dynamic. The photograph that you're looking at is a photograph. It's not a photograph. It's a drawing. It's an artist's depiction of a variety of Native American tribes in the United States in the 19th century. And the reason I show you this is because the human species is extremely diverse, and Native Americans were extremely diverse in the 19th century, just as they are today. And in fact, the human species is one of the most diverse species in terms of our physical appearance. And we tend to associate a lot of kind of identity with what we look like. But in fact, our physical traits, I mean like our skin color, our hair, and those kinds of things. But aside from those external traits, humans do share a lot of DNA and other physical characteristics, and part of that is because of these central origins. But as we began to move out of Africa into other parts of the world, we began to develop different tools. Physical adaptations also changed. For a period of time in Europe, a species that actually ultimately died out called the Neanderthals lived, and they had very different physical appearance, very different physical appearance. Neanderthals had very wide nasal passages because they lived in a really cold climate. Their nasal passages were extremely wide so that they could warm the air. The air actually could pass through these large canals, and they could actually warm the air. They were short in stature so that they could hold heat better. It's pretty amazing how much we adapted to that climate and how we adapt to have adapted to other circumstances along the way. But the Neanderthals, like I said, have actually died out. So you're not an ancestor to a Neanderthal, if you were worried about that. Intermarriage among these hominid groups meant that our DNA and other traits began to be scattered. And by about 9,000 BCE, there were between 5 and 10 million humans on the earth, which is a huge population boom. There was a major population boom after the Ice Ages, in part because of this tool development, because of brain development, and this sort of change that took place where we had a major population boom meant that humans were coming into contact more often because there were simply more of us on the planet. And coming into contact more often, of course, meant conflict, but it also meant the opposite. It meant a coming together. And there was a lot of intermarriage, a lot of sharing of traits, and interchanging of DNA. And again, that's how we get what's known as cultural divergence, where culture groups and different ethnic groups, people with different DNA, different sort of traits, merge together. They diverge, they come together. The way that I like to illustrate it is thinking, about a slide like this. Early humans originally lived in these small family clusters. And then over time, those clusters started coming together because you had this intermarriage. But where were those clusters located? They weren't just located anywhere. They were located around water sources. And primarily they were located around rivers. And over time, these civilizations, these small clusters, became large clusters. Those large clusters then had more demands, there was more intermarriage, there was more food that was needed, there was more conflict that needed to be resolved, and civilization emerges. And so what we see is that civilization begins to emerge about 10,000 years ago around river valleys. As the ice ages end, these river valleys are created by the melting glaciers. The picture that you're looking at on this screen is of a modern melting glacier. And you can see the glacier sort of coming down into this canal. Of course, water seeks the lowest point, and over time it digs these, massive river systems. And we have the melting of the glaciers, rising of the seas. The rising of the seas in fact, cuts off different populations in Southeast Asia and parts of the Pacific that were once actually connected by land bridges. Those land bridges are cut off. And so in a fascinating way, you have now human populations that are going to be cut off from each other for 10,000 years until they really are rediscovered in the more modern era. These river valley civilizations are often called hearth civilizations. And hearth stands for sort of the heart or the central civilization. And the reason that people centered themselves in these river valleys was because river valleys were great places to live for humans. They provided food, they provided water, they provided transportation, they were places that animals gathered, and therefore they were good hunting grounds. And so these hearth civilizations become really interconnected. This is a photograph, in fact, that you're looking at right now, a map of the ancient civilizations of the old world. And if you look closely at this, what you will notice is that underneath each of those colored areas is the outline of a river system. And in some cases, it's two river systems. Furthest to the west, you're looking at the Songhai people and the people of Ghana, and you're looking at the Mali River. It's a massive river system in Western Africa, but also the Senegal River is right there as well. So we have, and it's not pictured on the map, but really important river systems. Move your eyes further to the east to North Africa, and what river do you see there? Of course, you see the Nile, the most important river system in northern Africa, which becomes home, of course, to the ancient Egyptian empires. But move further to the east and you see what is known as Mesopotamia, or on this map they call it Babylonia. And that is another name for it is the Fertile Crescent, the Fertile Crescent. And this region was between two rivers, one called the Tigris and one called the Euphrates. And this is a really critical hearth civilization. So too is the hearth civilization of the Indus and the Ganges River in what is northern India and southern China today. And then again, moving further to the east, you see the Khmer people who lived along the rivers of, oh gosh, how come I can't think of it right now? We'll think of it in a second, in southeastern Asia. So the Mekong River is what that's called. And then going north, you see the Yellow River or the Shang River. And just below that, it's not written out, but it's the Yangtze River. And this becomes the hearth of ancient Chinese civilization. So again, as the river systems develop after the melting of the glaciers at the end of that ice age which brought us so much change because humans began moving around the world, then we see humans beginning to settle. We see this cultural divergence where people are coming together in these communities where they are bringing different cultures, different ideas, and settling around these river valley civilizations. And predict in your mind what's happening here. You are seeing the birth of the ancient world. This is where the ancient world really is born. Okay, in the next lecture series, I'm going to talk about what civilization is, the characteristics of civilization, and what ancient civilizations, some of those early hearth civilizations looked like. So, okay, thanks guys.